In this part I'd like to show you how I'm laminating the last hull sections, installing the stringers as well as the centerboard case, the inner cockpit panels and the deck. Hello and welcome to this video. Last time I showed you how I installed the bulkheads and ribs. This time I would like to show you how I laminated the remaining areas inside the hull, installed some stringers as well as the centerboard case, and glued the inner walls of the cockpit and the deck in place. The only area of the hull that hasn't been laminated yet is the inside of the bow. So I sanded and cleaned everything and cut the fiberglass mat to overlap the fillets and cover the entire area between two bulkheads. To impregnate the wood, I removed the mat and coated the wood with epoxy. Then I placed the mat on the surface and began impregnating it, starting from the joint to prevent it from shifting too much. I applied a second coat of epoxy while the first one was hard but still tacky. I then cut all the stringers to the correct angle and length. And I had previously chamfered the center foredeck beam with a chisel. I then clamped the stringers to the correct positions, overlapping at the ends, marked the positions where to cut them and cut them with a Japanese saw. After that I sanded and cleaned all contact surfaces of the stringers and sealed the cutouts in the bulkheads as well as the ends of all beams with unthickened epoxy, and later with thickened epoxy. I used only cotton fibers to make the fillets strong. Once everything was prepared, I installed the stringers and clamped them in place. The excess epoxy was then shaped with a wooden spatula. The prepared centerboard case was installed in the same way, with the exception that masking tape was used to protect the hull and two pieces of wood were screwed to the hull to serve as clamps to pull the case down onto the hull. Before installation, I marked the correct position on the hull and the main bulkhead to facilitate alignment. This time I also added some color pigments to the epoxy as it will be visible later. When I positioned the centerboard case, I had to slide it over the loosely screwed on pieces of wood. Later, the centerboard case was pulled onto the hull using these pieces, which sit slightly lower than the case, and a few bolted on blocks. The recess for the centerboard will be milled out when the boat is turned over. The installation of the cockpit sides followed a very similar process. This time only the upper spar and the ribs were coated with unthickened epoxy for the installation. Then I applied the thickened epoxy. To prevent it from being squeezed away too much, I tried to bend the front edges of the panel inwards and attach the rear ends first. Once they were seated properly, I clamped the edge of the round cutouts to the rib behind it. The bottom edge was pressed against the ribs using wooden strips that were slightly bent from one side to the other. The top edge could then be clamped as usual. The excess epoxy was then shaped with a wooden spatula. Afterwards I filled the bottom edge from the inside with thickened epoxy. The visible joints in the cockpit will not be made until after the deck has been installed. The deck consists of 4 panels that are glued to the bulkheads, stringers and outwales. These panels require a flat surface. That's why I tried to identify any raised areas using a thin strip of wood that I bent to match the deck's dimension. Since there were only minor irregularities, I sanded those areas down. To reinforce the panel joints, I attached small pieces of wood to the first frame behind the main bulkhead. This is where the joint between the front and rear panels is located. The central deck beam supports the joint between the two front panels. Then temporarily I placed the front panels in position to check for gaps relative to the substructure. There were a few such spots, but they were small enough to be filled with thickened epoxy. Next I bolted a mast and boom bracket to the third bulkhead, which is used to transport my split mast and boom. The space in front of the first bulkhead is enclosed and will be fitted with inspection hatches. When cutting out the holes for these, I didn't want to cut through the stringers, so I cut them out before gluing the deck and marked the center positions on the outer walls. Then I coated all wooden contact surfaces with undiluted epoxy. The undersides of the panels were already coated with fiberglass and therefore don't absorb as much epoxy resin. Then I applied some masking tape to the cockpit and the outer walls and applied the thickened epoxy. Again, I tried to place the panels on the boat in such a way that as little epoxy as possible was squeezed away. To adapt them to the desired curvature, I screwed some wooden strips into the central deck beam. The outrails serve as a good support for the clamps, and of course I placed some strips between the clamps and the deck to protect the wood and distribute the load. Afterwards I checked to see if epoxy had been squeezed out anywhere. Inside the boat I couldn't reach the squeezed out epoxy, but in my opinion it doesn't look too bad. The aft deck was installed in the same way. Unfortunately, I underestimated the force needed to press it into place. Oops. I had actually planned to use only clamps for the outer edge and tensioning straps for the inner side, but this didn't press it down as tightly as expected. To fix this, I screwed the deck down using some scrapwood pieces. This worked well, but it left uglier holes that will need to be filled out later. After the deck had cured, I removed all the clamps and screws. Then I trimmed the protruding areas with a flush cutter and rounded the edge with an edge rounder. I hope you liked this video. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you next time.